Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name is John Milton. I am a Business Development Director here at the Global Institute of Credit Professionals. Today's webinar is going to be focused on AI within credit. We'll be looking at best practices, prompt patterns, and agentic applications. And we're lucky enough to be joined today by my colleague, Adam Ahmed. So Adam, can you give us a quick introduction, please?
Sure. Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Adam Ahmed. I am Director here at the Data Analytics and AI faculty.
Thanks, Adam. So let's kick things off. What I want to do before we get too much into the weeds of AI within the realms of credit is really just to look at large language models as a whole. I think some people on this call would be really familiar with what they are and how they work. But if you could give us a layman's view of an LLM, that would be a great place to start, and then maybe we can go a bit more detailed after that.
Okay, absolutely. So the term AI, artificial intelligence, as you know, used quite frequently these days, interchangeably to refer to the underlying technology being large language models. Mm-hmm. If we all remember, the term AI has been around for a lot longer. So, more than 20 years ago, people were using the word AI. But these days, because of the dominance of large language models and the feats of large language models, they're kind of used interchangeably. So when people say the word AI these days, they're probably referring to large language models, as you say. So large language models are essentially, you can kind of think of it as like the CPU of modern AI systems. It's kind of like the brain. It's essentially trained on what people have done, what people have said and written throughout human history, really, but that's taken from the internet. So you're looking at, encyclopedias, Wikipedia, social media, books, articles, research papers, and also content from things like videos and transcriptions and stuff like that from there. So what these models are doing is they're essentially compressing and they're producing an average, a statistical average of what a person would say given a particular, what we call prompt, which is simply just, you can just see it as a beginning of a conversation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's maybe keep things high level for a second. I think probably a lot of people will see different versions of ChatGPT coming out. We've got different models, Grok, Claude, all the rest of them. Can you give us a quick view of the state of play at the moment, and whether any of those is particularly important, say within specific sectors or parts of business?
Yeah, sure. So I think at this stage, I and maybe a lot of my colleagues as well, we're less interested on the latest release of a particular model. Yeah. I don't want to say that progress has plateaued or anything, but ultimately, if you compare it to the release of the iPhone, so you would see the differences between the early generations of iPhones would be very profound and significant. So there probably was a big incentive to upgrade, especially if you've skipped a year as well with iPhones. That's probably the same all the way up to something like an iPhone 10, perhaps. And then recently, I'm sure many people agree, it's we hear more about it's 1 millimeter thinner, or maybe it's built of a new material like titanium. And so that's perhaps what we're starting to see a little bit in terms of the raw model. So the release of models have become a lot more kind of incremental. So what's actually happening on the frontier of AI research now, or even applications and moving towards applications of AI, is really the engineering around it. So how we're integrating them into actual applications. And you've probably heard the word agent or agentic AI. It's thrown around a lot these days. I'm not sure if we're going to get a chance to talk about it today, but it would be good to maybe explore that a little bit further, because there is a big difference between just an AI in terms of a chat interface, yeah, right? Versus an actual agent, that actually is able to go off and, do stuff and execute commands. So I'd say if we're focusing on what the current state of the technology is, I think model sizes have reduced a little bit, where models like GPT-4, for example, were, very large. So probably over a trillion, well over a trillion parameters. And that can be very expensive in inference time. So when you're actually serving these models to customers through these APIs, it can be very expensive to run. And so model sizes have kind of reduced slightly. At the same time, models have become a lot more specialized. So you're seeing a lot of models specifically for coding, yep, and doing really well at coding tasks and things like that. But I think the focus today, and probably the focus this year, is going to be more about agentic AI and, of course, specific agents with applications in particular fields. And what we're seeing mainly is the kickstart of all of that, the catalyst, is going to be the huge success I will describe of the AI agents in the software development space.
Cool. So we've got the idea of the car now. We're just kind of refining the engine at this point.
It seems like it, yeah. Or we're looking at more specific applications, rather than, so the models will be released, but what's really happening now, in my opinion, I'm not too excited about the difference between a GPT 5.2 versus 5.3. I'm more interested in what's happening with Claude Code CLI or Open Code CLI, agentic coding, because what you're able to do then is now actually spawn up and deploy essentially a number of different agents to carry out tasks for you. So yeah.
Okay. And so, I mean, let's come back to a term that you've mentioned a few times. So I think I've heard the term agentic conflated with a few others, maybe generative AI and other parts of the AI world as a whole. Can you give a clear explanation of what we mean when we say agentic AI specifically?
Yeah, so there is a huge difference, and I have seen it used interchangeably a lot as well. And I think it's a kind of like a term that's hyped up now a lot, agentic AI. But there is a very distinct difference between an experience where you are in some kind of chat or conversational wrapper. So let me just give you a basic example of a deployment we see in your enterprise level. So here at Fitch, we have Fitch GPT, as you know. So essentially, what that is it's a chat conversational wrapper around, and it's connecting to, for example, AWS Bedrock, because we already have a, established relationship with them as a vendor. So it's a lot safer to go through them rather than go straight to Anthropic or OpenAI. So we're not sharing our data. And so essentially we create a wrapper around it, and there's a chat interface. And that's what people are familiar with when it comes to using AI, right? You have a chat interface, and that's been around since the beginning of, ChatGPT 3.5. Now with that, the restriction is it's not easy to actually take a conversation or an instruction and have the AI go out there and in fact do something for you in the real world, okay, let alone actually understand the context within which you work, so on and so forth. So with an agent, you can achieve that essentially. Of course, a lot of security concerns and different kind of safety concerns come with that, and those are real concerns, and we can talk about them later today. But essentially, with an agent, it's the same kind of CPU, you could say, or the model under the hood. It might be a slightly specialized model with slightly different instructions, okay? But there's this kind of engineering layer around it where it's kind of like in this loop. So the agent will want to go off and try and execute some commands until a goal has been achieved.
Yeah.
Okay. And so an example of that today is something I use every single day, which is called Open Code. So as a software developer myself, this has been the most impactful change in software, technologies or tools for software developers, programmers, engineers, in my entire career, to be honest. Okay. So this actual agent, rather than just an LLM I'm speaking to, so no longer kind of copying and pasting things, can take instructions from me, and within a set, within constraints and within limits, sometimes it does break those constraints. So therefore, of course, there are security concerns, but we try our best to keep them within those constraints, and they can go off and actually execute commands and do work in the real world, which you'll see immediately in front of you. And the comparison that's often made is with like junior. So if it's a software engineering scenario, then we compare these agents to junior engineers, right, or junior employees. Which is being done quite frequently. All we kind of mean by that is you have to still, train these models. You have to kind of hold their hand a little bit, and you can expect from them the kind of level of awareness or the capability to run some tasks which would be somewhat equivalent to what a junior engineer would be able to do.
Let's maybe switch to the view a little bit now and think about the roles of a credit analyst, and then how AI might be affecting their position at the moment, or how they might integrate it into their workflow. Have you had examples of that as a trainer, or potentially even related to your own role at the moment?
Yeah, so essentially there's a delay between what a one person's hobbyist startup can achieve. They can adopt all the latest trends and releases without fear of disruption of core enterprise architecture. They have much less security concerns. And so when working within a larger firm or larger organization, a lot of these things that are being spoken about or hyped up, whether that's online or on LinkedIn or places like that, it's very difficult for people to actually see that in reality in their roles, because it takes time for that to trickle over to, trickle over that kind of corporate fence. So I think it's for good reason. So rather than kind of like talk too much about AI agents when actually that technology probably isn't ready just yet for most people, I'll speak a little bit about how you can optimize the AI infrastructure that you probably already have.
Yeah.
And then I also want to give you an idea, and audience members an idea of what to expect from potential agentic applications as well. So one example of the security concern is if you're using an AI agent to help you, code or write software. We hear a lot today, a lot of people saying, should I even learn how to code?
Yeah.
Should I learn Python anymore? And we hear things like, 90% of some code bases can be written by an AI. So let me just dispel some of that right now. So if you are in fact writing a Python code or Python script for what we call personal software, okay, and so you can equate that to, or as an example, you can look at how VBA macros work, right? So like 20, even today, but 15, 20 years ago, you want to kind of automate something on your desktop workflow. So you record a macro, and then essentially, if you think about it, you've taken work away from what would have been done by someone like a software engineer, right? And the reason why you could do without that is because, first of all, the infrastructure was there. It was intelligent enough, even in those days, to generate the code for you. And also, you're not trying to deploy that anywhere. So you're not trying to make a claim that this little automation task that I need done in Excel is going to be meaningful or useful to anybody else, right? It may be, but ultimately it's just something that you want to achieve. So for that reason, these tasks were really small and they're surmountable by quite basic technology. So the truth is, AI can write code very well to a very high level, but we're looking mainly here at, when you quote things like 90%, you're looking at personal software. So the ability to actually write something and have something run for you locally or solve a local task. The figure is around 29 to 30%, latest figures as recent as last week, published by OpenAI, I believe, where we're talking about code in production written by AI. So it's around the 30% mark. And that's just because there's a lot more to deploying software and actually setting up pipelines and automate and integration pipelines and CI/CD. There's a lot more to that than just writing the physical code. There's a lot of different integration that you have to think about.
And presumably this is also a case of, if something isn't working as it needs to, whether that's in code, whether it's in a model, you need to be able to know, why the output isn't right.
Yeah.
To be able to troubleshoot it right.
Yeah, to a large degree. Now, of course, you are able to you can always ask the AI. The problem with that is you're going to be restricted within this kind of like feedback loop of, what this one shot was able to achieve. So, but one shot means, what am I able to achieve by just one line prompt saying, here's what I want, and go, right? So if you need any kind of feedback, then that's where an expert has to come in. So some of the security concerns here are, some things that have happened recently is the AI will hallucinate, as we all know. And so when an agent hallucinates, the risk is that that hallucination can actually be kind of like deployed, so to speak. So there are some famous cases recently where you've got these NPMs, so these package managers, where they hallucinated that up, and then a lot of repositories just copied it. So you had like 300 repositories appear on the internet within a few weeks who have all copied this hallucination. And so a bad actor, someone who has malicious intent, just decided, well, if they're all thinking that this link exists, I'm going to go and create that link.
Yep.
So I'm going to upload something based on that link, and then they now download my spyware, malware, or things like that. So that's why there's a lot of guardrails in place. As for what people can do more, for in the immediate or short term, and what they can learn and pick up on and prepare for agents, becoming part of their workflow, I think a focus needs to be made on context engineering, understanding and appreciating the importance of how to manage context and not just the prompt engineering side of things. Prompt engineering was a very early term that came around. That's now become quite advanced and sophisticated. So I'd see, non-technical people maybe focusing on more things like prompt design and prompt patterns, but then also, as I say, prompt context engineering, because that's usually where the bottleneck is with applying AI effectively in the workplace.
Let's bring this into the credit realm a bit. If let's say you're working as a credit analyst, you might spend a fair bit of your day plugging information into a pre-populated model, and then you're making recommendations off the back of that. To what degree can we for instance, take 5 years of financial data on a single company, feed it to AI, and then expect results which might be comparable to the Excel's output? Is that a possibility? Is there anything we can do to make it to get useful outputs from information like that?
I'd say that's probably the term misuse probably is an overstatement, but that's probably, let's say, we need to kind of like adjust how optimally we're applying AI if that's the intended use case. So if you have a logic-based or rule-derived based model for analyzing a company's financial history and based on different data points, and your model is causal, so it actually has a rule-based system, then a large language model in its current technology, and that's, by the way, it's baked into the actual way it works. It's not something you want to tweak. It's how it operates is not suitable for that application. But there are definitely places in that journey from data acquisition all the way to the consumption of the data where an AI or an AI agent can be very valuable. Okay, so let's pretend you have this in a Excel workbook, right? And there's logic in there. Now, the question is, how did that data get into the Excel workbook, right? So how did you go through all the kinds of unstructured and non-standard data?
Yeah.
And how did you go through unconventional sources of data, right? How did you source that and parse it and get it into the state that you wanted it in order to be fed into a model in the way that the model is expecting? And that is a very strong use case for AI. So, it can go through 500 different pages, for example, looking at very unstructured data, a flagging system to help you focus on specific areas of interest within a history of a company and all the different data points you can reach. And then one agent can do is it can actually execute that script that you have, which is a logic-based script. So there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. So although a large language model should not replace a clear, explainable, logic-based calculation, it can in fact execute a Python script, for example, that contains that logic. Okay, and so there's debate whether an AI can kind of like do that work or not. The question is yes or no. So you wouldn't want it to actually try and attempt to calculate a rule-based system, but you would probably be interested in deploying an AI agent to be able to, first of all, curate the data, acquire the data munging, the data wrangling stages, data preparation, pre-processing, feature extraction, data mining, data engineering. All those stages can be done very well by AI. And then what you want to do is you want to insert these logical rule-based systems, whether that's an Excel workbook or probably be easier, something like a Python script or a PowerShell script, where that can be executed at specific times within it. So that's where I see large language models kind of like take part in that process. It isn't to replace the logic. You want the logic because that's your explainable, that's your human explainable. It's deterministic, it's repeatable, right? So you can't just produce like a random result on a company and then run it again, because then it becomes an anecdote, right? So it's not going to be actually data driven. It'll just be anecdote driven, and it'll be sample size of one. If you run it again and in fact you get a different response about the same company, then obviously that's a problem. So you want a deterministic model, but you want the data sourcing to be enriched with AI automation, large language model automation.
Another point that I'd like to go into a bit more detail on is prompt design, prompt patterns, because I think that one of the difficulties a lot of people face is, regardless of where they're working, but also specifically within credit, it can be quite difficult to engineer a prompt that will work for the output you want, and whether that's designing a persona that might act as a wrapper to that, or making sure that you're being specific enough to get the right outputs. So have you got any tips about how we might structure those prompts, or pitfalls we need to be aware of?
Sure. So let me start off by maybe framing where I think are some of the key areas that these learnings can happen. So number one, an appreciation, once you've understood the limitations and the benefits and application use cases for a large language model, to understand the crucial importance of context, which I'll expand upon in a second, and followed by the crucial importance of a prompt and how that impacts, and then your role as well. So these are the three areas I think will be very useful for people to focus on. I'll start where I finished actually. So looking at the roles, how are roles going to change? Not only do you have to kind of upskill with knowledge and awareness of how to manage context and how to engineer context and how to manage and engineer prompts, also an appreciation that I think people are going to have to really reconsider whether they are ready to take on more managerial roles. It won't be managing more people, be managing agents. And so when you're managing agents, you still have to put your manager hat on, because what you're doing is you're having to decide for the agents what is a priority, how they operate as well. So one of the key bottlenecks for agentic adoption, okay, agentic AI adoption, is if we haven't got our house in order to start with, there is no impact, there's no positive impact of saying, here are 10 AI agents, go off and do stuff. In fact, it's just going to exacerbate some of the weaknesses you had in your team to start with. So if you haven't got proper documentation, if you haven't got adequate processes in place already of how you can operate, if you haven't understood what kind of data you need and how you store or retrieve that data, then an agent won't make your workflow any better, right? And so that's what I mean by people morphing into or developing into more of a manager. And I even mean junior employees now as well. I think it's even more critical actually that more junior people start thinking like a manager, because they also will be required very soon to start managing agents. So the first thing you'll do when you're managing agents, as I said, is prioritizing tasks. The second thing is your appreciation of how you should be using those agents, whether you want to strengthen your strength that you already have. Do I focus on my strengths and just make that even better? Or do I focus on my weaknesses as a human employee, right? What weaknesses do I have? And do I want to patch those weaknesses with an AI which won't complain, it won't get bored, they're infinitely motivated, right? And so now I'm not saying there's a correct answer to that. Me personally, I like patching my weaknesses, right? Anything that I used to hate doing, I used to always leave to the end, right? That's where I'm getting my agents to work on. And it feels great because I suddenly feel like a more complete all-rounder, in programming, in software development, in software engineering in general. Whereas before I had my clear weaknesses and strengths, right? Or you can just say, well, actually, I'm really good at this. How do I turbocharge that with agents? See, that's more of a management decision. It's more of a strategic decision rather than just focusing on the actual work at hand. And then going back to context knowledge and prompt knowledge, let me just explain the significance of where context management fits in. And so by design, a context is the absolute limit of a capacity of an AI, right? It can be excellent. It can pass all these math exams, right? We can look at benchmarks. Once the context is full, that's it. That's like a car running out of fuel, right? And so let's say a car has, 200 miles of fuel. You're just not going to make it beyond to 300 or 400 miles. There's no point planning a journey that long. And so to continue that metaphor even further, if our data that we need looked at, for example, for my work, that would be like a repository or a collection of monorepos or a bunch of repositories as well. If that is more than the mileage of the model, then it just simply won't fit into the context. And so it can be difficult to know whether you're filling up that context window. So I'll give everyone like a rule of thumb. If your session is slowing down, it's taking longer in terms of time to first prompt, okay, that's a good indication. Number two, I'd always know what model I'm actually using, not just the brand name or the product name of kind of like who's providing that service for you. I want to know what the actual model is underneath the hood so I can research what the context limit, the context window is for this model. And a rule of thumb I'd give is when you reach about 25% of that context window, right, that's when you want to start taking measures to either getting ready to start a new chat, or figuring out how to compact that. So one of the techniques is through compaction. What you want to do is you want to start telling the model when you're about 25% into the context limit, please can you write me a summary of everything we've spoken of today, as if you are providing or preparing a handover document for the next model, right? And people think they can go all the way to 90% of the context limit to start doing that. The problem is the intelligence, so to speak, will just go through the floor by the time you reach 90 minutes. And so when you generate that handover document, it's already going to be so lossy, right, that it's not going to be an effective handover document. So you want to get started writing that handover document about 25% in. So that's kind of like compaction. Another way to manage it is ensuring that the data you're providing for immediate context is relevant. So you don't want to flood the context with things that you could easily have maybe cut down quite significantly yourself.
So if we had like an annual strategic report from a bank, you may want to cut cut the relevant pages, put them into a new document, and then feed the model that rather than the...
If it's a one-off, right? So if that's a one-off task, so you want to one-shot it and say, here's some data, do me this one task, right? Then it probably will be able to handle it. Okay, so you just have to study how long is this document and what is the context limit. But absolutely, if it's an ongoing, if you're looking at working with an agent, especially because by definition, an agent is going to go through this iteration, this for loop, and keep trying to do something. And ideally, you don't want to, see, the problem is you don't want to start a new chat. Once you start a new chat, you're wiping the slate clean, right? All the progress you've made in that chat is gone, unless you've actually compacted, right? So you've stored kind of like summaries of what you've done so far inside your root folder, for example, right? So that's the crucial importance of managing context. And then finally, we get onto prompt, which is what most people hear about, prompt engineering, prompt design. Yeah. The example I like to give here is a lot of people, we hear a lot of people say the very common phrase, which is, I asked AI and AI said. And that is one of my kind of like bugbears because I'll explain why. So if someone walks into a room and says, we're looking at this strategic decision, and someone says, I asked AI and AI said. So for me, it's one of two things. If I ask them, could you please go back and ask again? So just repeat that same prompt and ask it again. In fact, give me that prompt, the exact wording, and I will also run that prompt. And so will everyone else in the room. Okay, so there's 10 people here. Now, if we all get back the same answer, right, then I would suggest that was probably common sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so i.e. you're probably within the specific domain, and any domain expert would have known that that's the common sense answer. It wouldn't even be debatable, right? If genuinely every single prompt returned the same answer. Now, if the prompts returned a different answer, because remember the model is statistically approximating what does a human mean anyway, right? So you've probably guided it down a specific type of person through your prompt, so you've laid them up a little bit. But if it comes back with a different response, then I would suggest that saying AI said is probably the same as a coin flip, okay? Because if I just flip a coin and say, well, it's heads, that means we go for option A. That's the same thing as saying AI said, but then when we rerun the prompt, we get a different AI said response, right? AI is saying something different each time. So saying AI said is probably not good enough. So even though people might think, what's that got to do with writing a prompt? My point is, if you're approaching your prompting like that, where you're asking for an answer, right? Just here is some context, what's the answer?
Yep.
That's what leads to that behavior, okay? And so I would encourage, and it's partly because we are a learning company. So, for Fitch Learning, we are very interested in, and we're big advocates for using AI to learn, of course, right? So the big difference between a prompt that says, summarize this email and suggest an answer, or here's all this stuff, I'm a bit behind, just tell me what to say, or what's the answer to this question? The difference between that, okay, and actually learning. So I think this, what do you think? Okay, can I push back on that? Can you explain this to me again? What about this? Can you search the internet and tell me what some of the latest stuff is? When's your knowledge cutoff point? Oh, it's a year ago. I'd like you to then reference the internet, please, right? What are your sources? And you actually learn with AI, okay? AI can be a huge, enduring personal tutor, which, as I said, never gets bored, and is available 24/7, is infinitely motivated to keep helping you out and teaching you things and helping you learn, right? So the difference is one of them leads to potentially cognitive atrophy, cognitive dependency, and the other one leads to growth, right? So you're stimulating your learning process by approaching prompts in a way that's helping you grow your knowledge and your skills and your behaviors. And so that's the first thing I'd say. Approach an AI not to say, just tell me an answer, because that's like a coin flip. Rather than that, approach your prompt to seek insight and be involved and engaged in it. The second thing I'd say is it's very important to provide context in your prompt. At the same time, you want to be careful not to provide too much input, and without realizing actually you're just kind of laying up the AI to say a particular thing, because it's a filtered now statistical average of what the internet said, if that makes sense. And so if you're saying too much, what you're doing is you're encouraging the sycophancy. Because you're setting up the model to be more sycophantic. And so you want to really choose, engineer your words, craft your prompt really well, where you're keeping open-minded, you're staying open-minded, but you're saying, but here are the facts, right? Here's the data, here's what's happened, here's what we have, here's the state of affairs, here's what I'd like to do, And what are your suggestions, and what do you think of that? So that's a much more, I think, a healthier approach. And then finally, as you actually alluded to, personas can be quite powerful. One thing I will say though is, we provide training on AI applications in finance. We provide training on agentic AI software development and programming, large language models with Python, AWS, prompt engineering concepts of AI, risks as well. And one of the things we have is a lot of our clients, Anthropic provide training too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And one of the challenges, of course, we are an actual training company. So we use a lot of what they say and we incorporate into our training models, and we provide actual training. But if I go to the creator of Claude Code, okay, so for example, I use something called Open Code. It's very similar to Claude Code CLI. I've got it running right now, actually. And the creator of the technology, is saying that here's my stack, here's what I do. I provide context like this, and my prompt looks like that. The very next day, a research paper comes out saying that, in fact, we've studied it, and not only do these techniques not work, they actually degrade the performance. Okay, so if that's coming from the creator of Claude Code, you can see that this technology is very early.
Yep.
So I would encourage people not to premature optimize, right? Yeah. That's the problem, is we don't want to prematurely try and optimize how we use AI before the dust has settled. And so stay open-minded, try out different things. Don't be afraid to open a second tab and say, here's what this AI is saying. What do you think, right? And stimulate that discussion and keep open-minded. And what you don't want to do is say, AI said, right? That's just not enough.
I can see we've got quite a lot of questions coming in. There's one that I thought might be worth jumping straight into, because I think we've kind of alluded to it already, which is, how far can we rely on the accuracy of the outcome? Can we rely on it and put it into a credit paper for a credit assessment? And I think some of that's going to depend on what you're trying to get out of it, right? If you're just asking a yes/no question of, is this business creditworthy? It's probably not a good way to be using that model. But, similarly, I think that agentic AI, for instance, may have a useful part to play in the run up to that, in assessing your data. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I've always seen it so far is that any AI that you're using is an extension of yourself. And so anything that, whether it's 10 different agents, or I've got 5 different chat sessions opened up, I've got, Copilot running to help me with some of my emails. Ultimately, the output is me. My name's on it, right? It's my account, and this is what I'm saying. Now, unless in the future we treat these AIs as, to have agency, and they have employer rights, and then they're actual employee in a company, so some very progressive companies have started to play with that idea. They have actual email addresses that you can add them with, but even then, the entity is not defined legally.
Yeah.
So until
you can't sue them when it goes.
Yeah, exactly. So until any of that happens, which is a bit dystopian, to be honest, but until any of that may or may not happen, you are ultimately responsible for everything that AI says.
Yep.
And I think a lot of the embarrassing kind of hiccups and examples of even early adopters, they're more prone to it, because an early adopter will race to be an early adopter, having great talent, great infrastructure, senior sponsorship from their executive leadership as well, but then they'll lack the responsible AI component to that, and which will just make them look AI immature. Even though they're early adopters, will make them look AI immature. And so some of the famous examples, I'm not going to cite names, but in getting caught, you could say, well, the fact that the word caught is being used, using AI, is a bit interesting, because everyone's using it. But the point, I think, when we say someone was caught using it, what we mean is they put it into production, they served it to clients, they put it in front, and they let it represent their name without really reading through properly.
Yeah.
So I would say take ownership of everything that AI does. One thing I will say is, I'm much more interested, not in the content AI generates. Okay, I'm much more interested in, can I use an agent to do something for me?
Yep.
And that's a lot more profound, in my opinion, than producing text, for example, right? What's been so fascinating as a software engineer is looking at my entire group of projects, whether professionally or hobbyist projects, and saying, what are all the things I've wanted to do? That thought people have. If only I had 10 helpers, or 10 employees, right? I'd get all this stuff done. Well, now actually that's a reality, right? And this is hype free, by the way, right? I'm not from an AI company. I'm not from an AI lab trying to raise money. I'm saying that is a genuine, huge quantum leap in how AI has progressed. It's the introduction of ChatGPT, maybe some stages of progress in the middle of RAG and things like that, but really the next bump has been through agents. And so, as I said before, I'm able to deploy multiple agents. My bottleneck is my ability and skills as a manager, right? So I'm sometimes losing track of how many agents I've got and what they're doing. And I'm not building up a environment where they're talking to each other properly. That's a managerial problem on my side. I'm not able to manage 10 agents currently. So I need to reduce. See, that's a management skill. So I've actually cut back, and actually now I'm running maximum 3 agents at a time, because I've realized that's a healthy scope of what I can manage and get them to do, right? And so I'm much more interested, rather than looking at what can AI say something and can we put it into a report. Rather than that, I'm looking at, can I look at my workflow and use AIs to go off and actually do things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got another one, which is, what's your opinion on models like Claude for financial services? Can it be disruptive for analysts? I think, part 2 of that is quite easy to answer. Yeah. Part 1, I guess it's maybe dependent on the nuances of a model, and whether there are any specific, maybe that or other models which are particularly geared towards being efficient within financial services.
Yeah, look, what I'd say is absolutely yes. Of course, it's going to be disruptive. If you take 2 tax professionals, 35, 40 years ago, right? One specialist, 40 years, seasoned tax specialist, right? And maybe someone just starting off their career. And you gave them both Excel when Excel first came out, like as a tool, right? Nobody would say that this junior analyst is now just as effective as the experienced professional. Okay, and so I think the inability for you to adapt and be agile and grow and research yourself, like what is going to impact my role and what do I need to adopt. That's the bottleneck. It's not the fact that there's going to be technology, because everyone has the technology. As a programmer myself, some people can vibe code and they're like, oh, I don't need a programmer. So okay, fine. So what I say is, okay, just do me a favor. So go to your employer and say, I've just vibe coded out our entire infrastructure. Can you please just take my code, right? And no one's going to adopt that, right? So it's really good for you for personal software, for personal projects, and for a lot of stuff, just like macros used to work, right? But as an actual software engineer, there's so much more I can do. And so rather than me shying away from it and saying, oh, I'm going to continue coding by hand, no, I should adopt it and now turbocharge my capabilities as a software engineer, as a data scientist. And so that's what I would encourage everyone to do, so that you have Claude in Excel now, right? You've seen it. Here's my take on that. So Claude in Excel, you can write a prompt to say, give me a pivot table and give me a chart, okay? Now, it will do that. So personally, okay, that's not that profound to me, because I would much rather the experience of the clicking, right? And then this in 5 seconds to get the pivot table I need, rather than, because I'm already typing too much. I'm on my phone, speaking with, friends on WhatsApp, I'm at work, I'm emailing. I don't want more of this typing personally, and I'm coding and programming all the time as well. So I'm writing commands. So I'd much rather just learn Excel and then just build a pivot table. It happens to be quite an easy thing to do. Okay, so and then obviously if they get it wrong, or if you change your mind, you're gonna have to write a new prompt. So you have to continue typing all the time. I can't see that as the future. Okay, I may be wrong. Yeah. So that particular application doesn't seem that, everyone's like, wow, it can do it. Yes, it can do it. Doesn't seem that profound to me. Yep. Because we had macros for many, many years. At the same time, if I'm able to actually get an agent to go off and do that to multiple workbooks at the same time, and actually help me prepare the data, right? So it depends where it fits on that pipeline. So from the acquisition of data to the consumption of data, where can I plug in these agents to actually work? That can then become quite impactful. So I would encourage everybody to accept, first of all, that yes, the role is changing. Don't get too bogged down by a lot of the hype. There is a lot of hype, okay? And at the same time, figure out how you can become, version 2.0, where you're now able to manage agents to help you do your work more effectively.
We've got one, which is, you've mentioned that you're running multiple agents. Which ones do you run? And as an absolute beginner, where do you get them from? So I'm assuming this person is, maybe they've got access to ChatGPT, but hasn't gone any further than that.
Excellent question. So we in the software development world have got first access to this new frontier of agents. And the reason why is, it turns out that this might be the only agent you need. Okay, so, and the reason why is, a coding agent, okay, an agent that's able to actually, execute. It's not the code itself, right? It's actually it's a bunch of bash commands. It's managing your repository. It's doing all these things, clearing issues. You know, um, an agent that knows how to execute code can do pretty much everything else, right? It can then edit a Word document because I can write a Python script to edit a Word document or a TypeScript or PowerShell, right? And so if you think about it, the gateway to all agents is actually a coding agent. And so to answer the question, I use something called open code. There is something called Claude Code. Okay, I prefer open code for my personal use just because first of all, it's free, it's open source. I'm a big believer in open source. Our next webinar is next month, I believe, where we'll be dedicating that AI section to open source. Okay, if you're really interested in that, open source AI. We have an industry expert coming from there. And it's going to be a great discussion because I have open source technology that I've open sourced as well. So I've contributed to the community. I'm a big believer of it. So open code is an open source solution. Anthropic have Claude Code, okay, and it's fantastic, which you can use as well. And so that's what it's called. It's called Claude Code. It's different than Claude. You have a desktop version as well. There's no exaggeration. I can just open a new tab and just keep spinning up new agents and give them different tasks and just keep checking on them to just make sure their progress is going well. And again, I've become more of a manager. I'm managing the workflows rather than just focusing on what one agent is doing.
Adam, thank you for your input today. It's been really, really insightful. I'm aware that we've got a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. So for any of those, if you send us an email on institute@gicp.org, we'll get back to you directly. We'll be able to give you a bit more context. I think there are a couple which were may well have taken up another half hour just to answer. So do please email us. We can get back to those. One other thing from my side is, within the context of AI, I work for the Global Institute of Credit Professionals, and our qualification, the Global Credit Certificate, is being updated this year. We are adding a chapter dedicated to AI within credit. So really, we're looking at how you can use it, what the pitfalls are, what we need to be aware of, how do we put up guardrails around it, hopefully to make your role as a credit analyst more effective, faster, more accurate. If you're interested in that, we're running an information session on the GCC on the 10th of March. There should be a QR code on the screen now, which you can use to sign up. Also on that screen, if you've got a pen and paper handy, there's a discount code for the Global Credit Certificate itself. So a little plug from my side. To wrap things up, Adam, thank you very much for joining us today. And to our audience, thank you as well.